Hello again. What I want to talk about in this segment of my presentation is the psycholinguistic dimensions of teaching through two or more languages. So I want to talk about multilingual education for social justice, but here with a focus on what's the rationale for including students' first language in the education system. How do we address objections or concerns that if students spend more time in their first language, that's going to reduce their possibilities of success in the dominant language or languages? And these are concerns that have been expressed in multiple contexts throughout the world. Bilingual programs and multilingual programs have been implemented in virtually every part of the world. Increasingly in places like Europe and South America, there are programs that go under the name of CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning, where a second language is being used as a medium of instruction for part of the day. In North America, there are bilingual programs involving two languages of instruction for minority groups as well as for dominant groups. So bilingual education is not something new or uncommon. It's something that's been around for a long time. What has happened over the last 30 years is that there's been an accumulation of research about bilingual education that has, I think, documented research findings and theoretical principles that we can be very confident in at this point in time. As I mentioned before, these are just two books that have focused on bilingual education in contexts such as India and the Philippines and Africa and other parts of Asia and Latin America. And these books are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the information that's out there relating to bilingual education and its principles. So what I'll try and do in this presentation is sum up what we know about bilingual education and what are its implications. So what does research say about bilingual education? First of all, it says that bilingual programs for minority and majority programs for students have been successfully implemented in countries around the world. These programs generally produce better outcomes than teaching the language as a subject. So when we teach the language as a medium of instruction, when we use it as a medium of instruction, students attain far greater competency in the language than if we just teach the language as a subject. Spending instructional time through two languages entails no adverse consequences or effects on students' academic development in the dominant school language. And this applies to both students from minority language backgrounds as well as students from majority language backgrounds. So if we look at students from majority language backgrounds, for example, in the Canadian context, there are a large number, about 300,000 students across Canada in what are called French immersion programs, where they take approximately 2/3 of their instruction through French, which is a second language for them. Their home language is typically English. And yet their English skills develop just as well as students who are taking 100% of their time through English. So instruction through a second language does not entail any adverse effects on the development of students' first language. And I'll try and explain why that is later on. A third outcome or finding is that the development of literacy in two or more languages entails linguistic and perhaps more broad cognitive advantages for bilingual students. There's also an advantage in learning additional languages. So the kinds of research that has accelerated in terms of the number of studies that have been carried out over the last few years are studies that point to an increase in students' awareness of language and what you can do with language, which linguists will typically call meta-linguistic awareness. There's been also a focus on the fact that bilingual students tend to develop enhanced executive control. They have more control over their mental functions than students who have access to just one language. And as I said, they're better able to learn additional languages. So these studies have accumulated over the last few years and at this point are widely accepted by researchers and by applied linguists. A fourth outcome of bilingual programs is that significant positive relationships exist between the development of academic skills in students' first and second languages. Students who are doing well in developing reading and writing skills in their first language also do well in terms of developing reading and writing skills in their second and subsequent languages. So the stronger students' foundation is in their first language, the better they're likely to do in the second language. And that has obvious implications for multilingual education. And then finally, the most successful bilingual programs are those that aim to develop high levels of bilingualism and biliteracy. Transitional programs, or what sometimes are called quick exit programs, are less successful than programs that continue instruction through both languages. So obviously, in some contexts, we may need to start with a transitional program because we don't have the teachers who are trained, we don't have curriculum materials, but we should aim to continue the program for as long as possible because the results are cumulative the longer students are in the program. This is just one example of the research that has been conducted. This is a major review of research. It's 700 plus pages that was carried out in the United States on a panel appointed by former President Bush to look at exactly what is the research saying about the development of academic skills among second language learners, among language minority students for the most part. And their conclusion in relation to the effects of bilingual education is shown here. They say, in summary, where differences between bilingual and monolingual programs were observed, on average they favored the students in a bilingual program. The results clearly suggest a positive effect for bilingual instruction that's moderate in size. The studies that have been carried out on multilingual education in contexts such as the Philippines, such as India, such as various places in Africa, show precisely the same kinds of findings. Students whose first language is reinforced in school, who develop a foundation of academic skills in that language, have better prospects for success in the dominant language and for schooling generally. So we're looking at a broad consensus across a wide variety of sociolinguistic situations with respect to the effects of bilingual education. And when we compare that to the very frequent failure of students who are submersed in a second language context, who didn't understand the language of instruction and took a long time to acquire that language because very little support was there for them to acquire that language, then we can see that the history of school failure can potentially be reversed when we take account of what the research is saying about bilingual education. How do we explain the fact that students don't suffer in terms of their skills in the dominant language, despite spending much less time in that dominant language? There are a few visual metaphors that can help us to understand this. The first one here is what I've called the separate underlying proficiency model of bilingualism. And what this is saying, what this is trying to express, is the typical unsophisticated understanding of the person in the street regarding what bilingualism is. Typically, we think of bilingualism as involving two languages, or if we're looking at multilingualism, multiple languages that are located in our heads somewhere. So we have a first language proficiency and a second language proficiency. And these are expressed as two linguistic bubbles here. Well, if we start off with the notion that the two languages are separate in this way, then clearly, it follows that if we want to develop second language proficiency, if we want students to develop proficiency in the dominant language because we think that's more important, and many parents may also feel that's more important, then surely it makes sense to blow into or inflate that second language balloon. And if we spend time inflating the first language balloon, then it's not going to help the children's second language proficiency. So if we start off with a separate underlying proficiency model of bilingualism, we are immediately led to false assumptions regarding the effects of bilingual education. Because if this model were valid, then virtually everybody in this room would be in a curious predicament. If you're speaking one language with some friends and then a colleague comes along who doesn't speak that language and you switch into a common language, then if this model were correct, you wouldn't have any idea what you had just been talking about in the first language when you switched to the second language. Clearly, that's absurd. what is much more consistent with the research evidence is what I've called a common underlying proficiency model, where there's a lot of overlap or interdependence or commonality across languages, and input through either language can build up that common underlying proficiency. And once it's there, it's available in principle to the other language. Another way of expressing this is in terms of what I call the dual language representation, the dual iceberg representation of bilingual proficiency, where we can imagine, if we imagine language proficiency in one language as representing an iceberg, where as certainly we in Canada know, the icebergs have much more mass underneath the surface that we don't see than they do above the surface. And so if we think of things like the obvious aspects of language, phonology, basic vocabulary, as being the surface aspects of the language. But then the conceptual aspects, the academic aspects, the more sophisticated uses of language are things that we don't see as readily in everyday conversation. If we start off with that image of monolingual proficiency as representing an iceberg, then bilingual and multilingual proficiency can be understood in terms of overlapping icebergs, where even though the two surface aspects are separate, there's a lot of commonality or interdependence underneath the surface that we don't see. So what are the implications of this? Well, first of all, if we look at what kinds of things transfer, there are a number of aspects of language that research has documented transferring across languages. These are just some of the more obvious ones. But first of all, and most obviously, we're talking about transfer of concepts. So if a child has learned the concept of photosynthesis in science in one language, they don't have to relearn that concept all over again in the second language. They already have the concept. They may need to acquire new vocabulary, maybe new pronunciation in the second language, but the concept is already there. It doesn't have to be relearned. And in fact, if the child already has the concept, then it makes instruction in that second language about that concept much easier to understand. A second aspect that transfers is transfer of cognitive and linguistic strategies. So these might be strategies relating to effective reading or strategies relating to writing. So for example, if a child has been taught principles of paragraph formation in writing in one language, then these can just be reinforced in the second language. They don't have to be taught from scratch again. And the same applies to strategies such as prediction or use of graphic organizers, mnemonic devices, vocabulary acquisition strategies within school. These will transfer across languages. A third aspect, which will be there in most languages, but obviously some languages much more than others, are transfer of specific linguistic elements. So, for example, if we take that same word photosynthesis, if we look at the prefix there, the word photo, we can that prefix will probably appear in a number of different languages because the term is coming from Greek. It's the Greek word for light. So if a student understands what a photograph is or what photography is, we can move from that background knowledge that they have to explaining the role of light in photosynthesis. Some languages have vocabulary in common. For example, a lot of the Southern European languages are based on Latin and to a lesser extent Greek. The academic language of English is heavily rooted in Latin also. And so these languages will have cognate relationships across language. And obviously that will vary depending on the language. And then finally, there's transfer of phonological awareness, the awareness that words are made up of different sounds and the fact that these sounds can be pronounced separately. So if we go back to the whole question of educational success and ask, what exactly are we talking about here? We're talking about academic language proficiency. we're talking about the language of subject matter. For example, in mathematics, there's a very different set of terms that are used. Some terms are used in very different ways to the way we use them in everyday language. For example, in English, the word table has a very different meaning in mathematics than it does in everyday conversation. And so when we look at academic language, what we see is, first of all, knowledge of the less frequent vocabulary of a language, as well as the ability to interpret or understand and produce increasingly complex written language. If we were writing up a report on a science experiment that we carried out, our language will be very different than casual conversation with a friend. There are certain conventions or aspects of the language that will differ between academic language and everyday conversational language. For example, in English, academic language uses a lot of nominalizations. For example, a word like acceleration or fluctuation are nominalizations, nouns that come from verbs. Accelerate, fluctuate. We use a lot of the passive voice in academic language. And again, we rarely use this kind of language in everyday conversation. So when we look at academic language, we're looking at language that has to be taught, and also language that it takes students a considerable amount of time to acquire. In fact, we're acquiring academic language throughout our schooling. And so it will take students who are learning through two languages, time to catch up in the dominant language with respect to academic language. Typically, when we look at the trajectories of students who are immigrants to a country, Canada, for example, welcomes a lot of immigrant students every year. We're looking at a period of roughly 5 to 7 years, typically, for students to catch up in terms of academic language. And that's partly because they're catching up to a moving target. Dominant group students who speak the dominant language are not standing still, waiting for them to catch up. But also, academic language is complex, and it takes much longer to acquire proficiency in that language than it typically does in the much more restricted vocabulary and grammatical structures that we use in everyday conversational contexts. So what are the implications of understanding the nature of academic language? Well, one major implication is that we've got to go where academic language is found. And academic language is found in two places. It's found typically in classrooms, and it's found in printed texts. It's found in books, it's found in articles, it's found on much of what's on the internet. And so students need to gain access to that if they're going to acquire written language effectively or academic language effectively. So extensive reading is crucial in enabling students to catch up. And ideally, when we're talking about a multilingual education program, we are ideally hoping that students will be able to read in both languages extensively. And then finally, frequent writing across a variety of genres is also extremely important in terms of developing academic language. It's not enough to just acquire passive knowledge. Students need to be able to use the language for writing purposes, and they need to be able to do powerful things in the language. So in studies that colleagues of mine and I have carried out, students from bilingual or multilingual backgrounds have written dual language books. They've illustrated these books. They've put them up on websites. They've been read by thousands of people. This is doing something powerful with your two languages. And developing or showcasing one's competence in two or more languages is a powerful aspect of identity affirmation or identity enhancement. So I'll just wrap up with a brief sketch of a framework that I've used and colleagues have used to start discussion at the school level in terms of what kinds of things we need to pay attention to. What are the essentials pedagogically when we look at psycholinguistic principles and sociolinguistic principles relating to promoting bilingual students' academic skills? All of this is firmly rooted in research. There's a lot of research underlying this framework, but some aspects of it have not been incorporated effectively into policy at this point in time in contexts around the world. And so one aspect that has not yet been appreciated sufficiently by policymakers is the extensive research highlighting the role of literacy engagement in students' academic success. We're looking at the fact that students have to gain access to print, and then they need to get engaged with print if they're going to develop academic language skills. So, for example, if we look at contexts around the world, typically students who are from poor backgrounds, who are growing up in poverty, don't have much access to print in their homes. Their parents may not be highly educated themselves. They may not be readers themselves. They may not have any money to buy books or newspapers. And so there's a poverty of access to print in homes. Students will get access to print typically in schools, but sometimes it's not sufficient, and they don't have a basis or a foundation for making full use of that access to print, particularly if it's in a language they don't understand. So when we look at research that's being carried out by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and many other bodies, and the OECD's research involves hundreds of thousands of students, what they find is that literacy engagement, or more narrowly, reading engagement, is the strongest predictor of reading success in school. So if we broaden that to literacy engagement more broadly, to incorporate both reading and writing and other modes of engaging with academic language, then what the research is saying is that we need to find ways to engage students with print. If there aren't print materials in students' first languages, then we can look at ways of creating them by going into the cultural funds of knowledge that exist in communities, by transcribing stories that might be told within the community, and developing a basis for students to engage with print in their first language, and then transition from there and transfer those skills to the second language. So the research is saying literacy engagement is fundamental. We need to make sure that's happening. If we ask, how do we get students from bilingual backgrounds or who are learning a second language to engage with print and to engage with schooling more generally, there are four dimensions that we need to pay attention to. The research suggests are extremely important. Three of these are generally accepted in the research literature and in the policy literature in many countries around the world. These are the importance of scaffolding meaning. That means supporting students' access to meaning. If they're learning through a second language then that they don't initially understand, then we need to use visuals to support that language. We need to explain words. We need to use demonstrations. We need to use a variety of scaffolds or supports to enable students to gain access to the meaning. Again, another principle that is generally accepted is that we need to activate students' prior knowledge and build background knowledge. In other words, we need to connect to students' lives. If the instruction doesn't connect to students' lives, then they have no way of relating to it. We also need to extend students' language across the curriculum. If we understand the nature of academic language, we need to be teaching academic language, not just when we're teaching language explicitly, but when we're teaching science and when we're teaching mathematics and other subject area. Those three dimensions are well understood, and quite a number of curriculum materials have been developed that focus in on them. They're not controversial. But what has been left out in much of the research literature as well as policy documents is the importance of identity negotiation in the classroom. And this gets more into the sociological dimensions, where the messages that students get about their potential as individuals, their potential academically, their potential to succeed, the extent to which they are intelligent, imaginative, capable of creating knowledge rather than just being passive in the classroom. All of these messages, and messages about the value of their culture and their language, all of these messages will make a fundamental difference with respect to whether students will engage academically or withdraw academically. And in the past, we've seen a pattern where students' languages and cultures have been devalued, either explicitly, where students have been punished for speaking their languages in school, or implicitly, where they've just been ignored. They've been treated with benign neglect. In those cases, students are not only going to have more difficulty understanding instruction because it's through a language they don't understand initially, but also they don't feel very good about who they are, about their identity, and that of their community. So the school reinforces their marginalized or subordinated status. And so if that has been the historical pattern that's associated with school failure, then it makes sense that we need to begin to reverse that by putting identity issues and the negotiation of identity at the forefront of our consideration of pedagogy, and ensuring that the interactions we have with our students are identity enhancing rather than identity diminishing, which has been the historical pattern. So to wrap up, the conclusions with respect to primarily psycholinguistic dimensions of instruction in multilingual contexts are, first of all, that first language medium instruction should be maintained for as long as possible during the elementary years, and ideally beyond that, and with the dominant language or languages also being taught during this period. So it's not a case of forgetting about the dominant languages. They're crucial. But we need to provide students with a foundation whereby they can gain access to those languages and develop them to a high level. And the first language is a crucial component of that. Secondly, instruction should explicitly teach for transfer across languages. We know that transfer typically occurs, transfer of multiple kinds, but rather than leaving that to chance, if the teacher knows both languages, then pointing out similarities and differences between languages, picking up on things that students may have learned in their first language when we're teaching the second language, whether this be curriculum concepts like photosynthesis or strategies for reading and writing. We should be explicitly teaching for transfer of these dimensions across languages. And then finally, sustained literacy engagement in both languages should be emphasized throughout schooling. And literacy here should be understood not just as reading and writing in a narrow sense, but it should be understood in a broad sense as the oral and written repository of a community's cultural knowledge. When we bring that into the classroom, when we connect with the funds of knowledge that exist in communities, and when we enable students to connect with those funds of knowledge, then students will be much more able to get into literacy. They'll be able to talk about things that are relevant to their lives and that are relevant to their culture. And this is the foundation that students need to succeed academically. Thank you.